All right, so this is Miguel, and I'd like to use the option B to talk about my ethical perspectives. And I've tried to prepare some slides to support uh, the way in which I'd like to present my ethical growth and some core values that I've understood to be important in ethical leadership. I hope to complete this video in a reasonably short time. So some of the ideas that I'll present will just be a quick summary of the things that I have understood throughout the course, and some of the things that I've come across through my own professional practice and how I've tried to apply those ethical principles as I go through my daily job as an educational administrator. So I'll just pop over to my slide here, and hopefully everything works as I expect. So as I said, this is Ethical Leadership and Perspectives of Miguel Barca. And I begin with the tagline. The tagline that I'm using is the good, the bad, and the difference. I found this, a book I bought a number of years ago. I mean, I'd say maybe 15 years ago, a book by, I don't remember the author, and I should have checked. But it's the title was The Good, the Bad, and the Difference. And the title was what grabbed me. And amazingly now, I'm really, really interested in how we as educators resolve the ethical dilemmas that we face on a daily basis. I was in school today, and I mean, each situation I'm beginning to see quite differently. One of the things that I start to look at clearly is the idea that I see things so differently now than I used to before. As a young administrator, I do remember when I would pretty much resolve every issue about what was in the policies. I would very much see everything as, what does the policy say? And if it's not in the policy, then we need to put it in the policy. And without that kind of thing in the policy, then we need to act, we need to fix the policy. So I very much was, I'd say, going on into Shapiro and Stefkovich idea of ethical paradigms. I very much was an ethic of justice administrator. And I guess I could understand why young administrators would reside most of their thinking in that paradigm, because it gave them the security of the support. But as I continued to be an administrator, I've realized that it's really, really challenging to just make decisions only on the rules, so to speak. It really requires you to be a lot more nuanced in your understanding of real challenges that students faced and workers, and being a leader. So I've really, really appreciated the idea of seeing things differently. And I'd like to begin my presentation, my video, with a little story about my real understanding of this ethical perspective. And the idea is that I remember that I didn't realize that my daughter didn't realize that she couldn't see through one of her eyes. And it was really quite coincidentally that I realized that she couldn't see through one of her eyes. And strange enough, she didn't realize that she had very, very poor vision through one of her eyes. She just kept going through life, not realizing that she was seeing things in a weird way. And I remember when we realized this through some inadvertent conversation. And I went to the doctor with her to check it out. And when the doctor did the test, the doctor said, there's literally nothing happening in that eye. It's really, really I think the term was a lazy eye. And so we resolved to get a pair of glasses for her. And I remember the first day when I got those glasses and I took it home and she put it on. And for about 5-10 seconds, she just was so silent. She was so silent. She just kept looking around the house. And then she looked at her mother, and I remember her saying to Mommy, Mommy, now I know what you really look like. And I tried to probe that to understand what she meant, because that was such a powerful thing for a child to say. She was 8 at the time. And she said, Mommy, now I know what you really look like. And I remember asking her, and she said, for a long while, all her life, she thought everything around her had a blur, like it had these blurs around her. And only when she wore the glasses did she realize that things were stark. You could see things quite clearly. So for me, that was a powerful thing. And I'd like to use that as the kind of way that I'd like to see things now, because now that I've begun to do this course, I'm beginning to really reflect and learn to see things without the blurs that many people see. I want to see it stark. I want to see it clear. I want to see it sharp. I want to see it vivid. And when I'm in school now, I challenge myself, to learn to see things in a more ethical way rather than just through the black and white of school. I want to really learn to see the ethical dimensions in this. So Shapiro and Stefkovich, they wrote a lovely book, a book that is a staple in many schools, many educational courses, many business courses. It's ethical leadership and decision making in education. And it's learning to apply those theoretical perspectives in really complex dilemmas. Their book is based on the idea that there are lots of clashing codes, there are lots of competing paradigms, and in those competitions, they're not necessarily right and wrong. They're based on the idea they're competing in the sense that they're right versus right. And what happens is that two things that you may fervently believe in as a person, they collide in this one scenario. And they present a number of case studies. And you're asked as an educator to learn, ask some questions, consider your practice, reflect deeply. And so they provide in their book what they call multiple paradigms, and ask us as educators, they implore, they really confront us with our thinking and say, hey, what are the key ways in which you look at things, and are you looking at it through more than one paradigm? And so I want to share their four ethical paradigms. It's a lovely book. It's a book that I've kept at my bedside now and look at. And the four paradigms, they begin with ethic of justice. They speak about ethic of justice, where we look at what the rules and the policies and those things are, and we learning to resolve issues that fall in that space. And to be fair, as I said earlier, as a young educator, a young educational administrator, I did reside most of my solutions within that. If a child was at my office and they did something wrong, I wouldn't try to probe very deeply. I'd just say, well, the rules are the rules, and we stick to the rules. And my communication with parents were within those spheres as well. And perhaps I was bad at the time. Perhaps some people said Mr. Barker was harsh. But that was how I saw it, and I was very straight with that one. When I began reading Shapiro and Stefovich's book, I really realized that I was being limited and wasn't seeing things clearly. I wasn't seeing the blur. I was seeing things very, very blurred. I just assumed that this was how it was. You see it like that, and that was the key thing for an administrator to be doing. And so, but they provide three other dimensions apart from the ethic of justice. They provide the ethic of critique. And the ethic of critique is really a powerful one, because what it does is allow you as an educator and a leader to really question whether the laws that are on the book and the policies and the rules are really benefiting the people that they're supposed to benefit. You really are asked to think deeply about, is this really fair? I mean, one of the examples they cite is the idea that without the ethic of critique, perhaps we would never have the ethic, we would never be able to remove something like slavery from the books, because the idea is that that's a law, and I know. So we need to just bear those ideas in mind. Somebody once mentioned to me that the idea that so many things were illegal. Women weren't allowed to vote. Without the ethic of critique, you'd never be able to challenge a law that was already on the book. So we can't use what is legal to determine what is right. I think that's the key here. So I've learned to and what is maybe written down as a policy to determine what is right. So I've learned to really challenge that kind of thinking. The ethic of care asks us to be empathetic, really begin to think about how people feel. It's rooted in the ideas of feminism and gender specific, but it's really something about really thinking about, why would someone do something like this, and try to understand their motives and try to be able to empathize and understand. And so I, as an educator, I'm beginning to see the value of this as well. And then they bring in the ethic of the profession, which in many ways is it's like a melting pot, of all these ideas. It's really just like a mixture of all of this coming together. But the key thing about ethic of the profession is that it takes in so many other aspects, and it looks at the idea of what benefits the child, putting the child at the center of the discussion. You see, what the main thesis of Shapiro and Stefovich's book is to bring forward this idea of the ethic of the profession, because they believe that within teaching, there's not enough clarity on what the profession really stands for. And in this case, it says it's to benefit the child. What's the most important thing for the child? And so I've begun to really think about things, and at times say, how will this benefit the child? What is in the best interest of the child? And so, do I suspend the child? They go home, spend the day. Who benefits from that? Maybe perhaps they stay in school and do a service activity. These are the kind of things that I've begun to look at more deeply, rather than just apply the rules blindly. Begley wrote a lovely article in the Australian Principals Center journal, and he talks about values in educational leadership. Do they really matter? He brought forward about 35 different dispositions of good ethical leadership, and it's a lovely thing to see that list. It's some fantastic what we call characteristics that as a leader you could really aspire to be exceptional in all of these. I remember at the start of this course, we were asked to identify 3 things that we really believe are essential for ethical leadership. And I think from that list, it was a similar kind of idea. I could identify some things that would really resonate with me as a leader as I try to develop and grow more. He brought forward some ideas, what he calls myths. Talks about values consistency, the idea that we maintain the same values through everything. He questions whether that's really, really possible. He talks about cultural isomorphs, the idea that we might have words that have particular meanings, but within different communities, those meanings are different. His example he talked about was like democracy. Do we all see democracy as the same? I mean, we have so many situations in the world where people talk about what is a free press, and in different scenarios, that's totally different. He brought forward Ken Strike's idea of thick and thin values, where we have values, for example, like inclusion. And the challenge is the idea that inclusion is really quite exclusive in some ways. And he talks about inclusion as a thin value, because that could mean one thing in the community. But then he talks about what about a thick value like community, which really brings inclusion inside, and then talks about how that fits and how that works. Talks about ritual rationality, where people bring ideas that they rationalize just to make sure that it gets implemented. And we see so many of that within our school, and people question these as ethical or unethical practices. They say, hey, why did you do this? And people have lovely ideas and reasons why, but long term you realize that they may have done this for their own personal benefit. For example, administrators who may bring in new positions in order not to make certain decisions. And you might say, oh, they will call it distributive leadership, but in principle what it was really an obfuscation, really delegation, not necessarily delegation, but perhaps a kind of passing the buck to someone else, so they could blame someone else for it not to happen. And these kind of things may even be coming from deep belief that this is the right thing to solve the problem, but deep down inside that person, sometimes it resolves a personal conflict that they may have. Age and other factors, depending on where you are in your career, you may perhaps see things totally differently. If you're a new teacher, again, you perhaps may want to focus on other things, but as you get older, you're thinking about administration, you're thinking about other things. And perhaps what happens there is that you make decisions that help you to resolve that. So again, he talks about these as myths that exist within the values and lies to some extent that he sees as we need to really explore as we talk about ethical leadership. Deal and Peterson bring in the idea of the leadership paradox, and so many situations we see both of these sides are really happening, and we think sometimes people need to be consistent, but it's very difficult to be consistent, and that's where the paradox really comes in, because someone would say we need to allocate resources equally, but that may be for a particular situation. In another situation, it might be right to distribute resources where they are most needed, and that could be within the same school, within even the same department. So we try to think of things as being consistent, and we end up with problems that are not really ones that are simple. They're complex problems that require different parts to be handled differently. But he gives a list here of things. Plans must always be revised. Another person say, plan carefully. So you don't have to measure twice, cut once, that kind of thing. Another person may say, the leader is in control all the time. Another person, the leader does not control. The same person might have a situation that they say that leader does not control this. So, it is a combination of ideas, a leadership paradox, they say. It's something to bear in mind as an ethical leader, how difficult it is to be consistent and all these kind of things. Tuana wrote an article on a website called the about moral literacy. Her argument is that we need to have a fourth literacy. And the fourth literacy that she's talking about is, in addition to the reading, writing, and arithmetic kind of idea of what schools does, but she want to bring in the idea of a moral literacy, and the moral literacy, is based on the idea that we need to be knowledgeable about the issues that we are talking about, really understand the big ideas and the big concepts that are at play when we're really discussing some big issues. In the article, the reference is made to the stem cell research. And we see this on so many big ideas, big conflicts, big controversies, that they're simplified into one simple kernel that really mischaracterize the real issues that exist within the debate. You end up having arguments about whether, it's right to kill a human or not, and talking about murder, when sometimes we're talking about other things, really more important things about maybe, for example, does a woman has the right to make a decision about what she does with her body, but people narrow these down into simple little channels in order to have debates in areas that they're comfortable fighting. So one of the things about moral literacy is that if you're going to be moral literate, you need to be knowledgeable about the things that you're dealing with. And so if you're in an educational sphere, very, very important that you understand the kind of challenges that face educators, and how you resolve those is trying to understand, for example, how different agencies interact in the environments that you work, and how different people and cultures view different things, in order to be able to communicate effectively and use the right kind of terms and phraseology in order not to offend, but to actually unite. So that knowledgeability is very, very important. Interestingly, knowledgeability is also one of the IB learner profiles. So it's really quite a nice one to segue into that. Moral virtues, having moral virtues, honesty, fairness, respect, responsibility, and caring. Very important that as a leader you have these, or try to develop these and feed these and practice on these and strengthen these daily. And then the last one is moral reasoning, the ability to, have ways in which you work things out. You need to have ways in which you deal with problems as they come around. Otherwise, you're going to not be able to have the skills to handle problems as they come. If you are going to have to, if you just wait until you have situations to try and have protocols for how you handle them, then what really happens is that you spend a lot of time trying to recreate the wheel. There are many, many protocols out there, many, many practices that are already proven to be good, solid ways in which you can resolve ethical and moral dilemmas. Sharma provides 10 things that authentic leaders do. The idea of authenticity in leadership is a big, big idea that's coming through in education. And it's not very far from the idea of being an ethical leader, because for you to be ethical, you need to be authentic. They speak the truth. They lead from the heart. They have rich moral fiber. They are courageous. They build teams and create communities. They deepen themselves. They're dreamers, people with visions, they care for themselves as well. So you can't just focus only on, your work. You have to also have a balanced life. You have to think about wellness. You need to make sure you eat right, you sleep right. Your family is happy. You do the things that make you happy, They commit to excellence rather than perfection. And that's a big difference. Some people want to be perfect rather than being excellent. And the two is different. Perfection really focuses on a personal drive and maybe a personal need, personal craving, so to speak, while excellence is about doing the best you can in the situations that you're in. And so you're depersonalizing your action. And so you can be seen to be not excellent in certain situations, but if you strive for perfection, you personally will begin to challenge yourself and say, why am I not being able to do this well? Is there something wrong with me? While with excellence, you could say, what could we do differently? So these ideas, you commit to excellence rather than perfection. And they leave a legacy. You really focus on what do people remember of you when you leave these spheres. And I remember a new head teacher who came to one of my schools looking for being recruited, and I did ask this question: how do you want to be remembered in 3 years later when you leave, 3 years from now or 5 years from now? And that was really one that they found quite challenging, because that really goes to the core of what kind of leader you are. Whether you want to be remembered as someone who was ethical or someone who had a rich moral fiber, it's that kind of thing. But some people don't really think about this. They maybe focus on a day-to-day job and not real visionary leadership. So, it's powerful. One of my favorite writers in this area is a guy called Sergiovanni. I have his book, and I really, really use his book to kind of keep me, thinking about it. he talks about the idea of a moral dimension based on purpose, values, and beliefs can transfer a school from an organization to a community. In his book that he wrote called Rethinking Leadership, he actually switches this from a community to an institution. It's much more about schools. And he said from an organization to an institution, which was quite powerful, because he talks a lot more about how the leader needs to be a steward. He talks about the stewardship of the organization, someone who's actually put in a position of leadership to really take this organization from one place to another, and not necessarily to really stop it from growing, but to put systems in place that make it grow. He uses the idea that the leader is the hand, the head, and the heart. And the heart is where the whole part of the whole the ethical leadership comes in, the idea of being moral and strong moral leadership. Now, one writer that I had very little idea about until this course began is a guy called Rushworth Kidder. And here's some, his book, How Good People Make Tough Choices, powerful book. Number of writings on the internet about him, a number of resources that I found online that really tries to explain Kidder's view. He maybe would be an educational ethicist in that sense. And powerful quote here. It says, ethics is not an act of inoculation. It's not an act where you just take a syringe and put something in you, and then that ethical leadership is in you, and they won't ever make bad decisions again. It is a process. I've never met anyone who has good judgment simply because they once had good judgment. And we see that all the time in our organizations, where people make one good judgment, and from that moment onwards, they're seen as leaders. And a number of bad judgments after that, people still refer to the good ones. Likewise, we see people who make one or two bad judgments, and they're also equally lauded or boxed in as someone who make bad judgment. They say he says they have it because they keep exercising it. Good judgment is not one thing, it's a process. That's what ethics is about. Practice, exercise, and do it right at every turn. Now, he is very much into the idea of protocols about solving ethical dilemmas. And so I'd like to kind of spend a little time talking about Kidder, just to explain my thinking, my understanding, my learnings and wonderings while working with Kidder's work. So he talks about the right versus wrong tests. He really believes that when you're faced with situations, you must think deeply about whether it's right v wrong. Because if it's right v wrong, we have a moral question here. And would it pass the smell test? Would it be able to, if you look at it again, does it really make you think that it goes against anything that you believe in morally? Role model. Do you want to be someone that someone looks at and say, this is how you handle this situation? The gut test, is there something deep down? It's similar to the stench test. Legal test, is it right? Is it legal? Sometimes things happen. A kid caught, maybe, for example, fighting. Is it legal? For them to be fighting, or vandalism, or going somewhere stealing something. These are things that don't require an ethical dimension. It's really against the law. Perhaps in its resolution, we might bring something in, but we need to first classify it as a moral problem. Professional standards, teachers may be doing things they shouldn't be doing. Front page test, if this comes out, how would you look? How do you feel about this? If this comes out when you resolve it, is it resolved in the right way? So he talks about right to wrong. Also spend some time really trying to explore the idea of right versus right. This is coming back to the ideas in Shapiro and Stefkovich's book about multiple perspectives, multiple paradigms. He provides 4 paradigms that he believes will resolve most ethical dilemmas. He talks about the individual versus the community. It is right for an individual to have rights, and it's right for someone to think about the community as well. So it's not about right or wrong. It's where the collision comes in, and how do you resolve those dilemmas. Short-term versus long-term. Schools daily have to make decisions that are short-term or long-term. And sometimes the way you resolve them is finding something in the middle, a compromise, so to speak. But both are right. Sometimes you have to do things in the short term. You maybe have to put a lock on the gate, as Joe did. But long-term, someone might say, what if there's a fire? But long-term, he may even say that this decision seems short-term to you, but to me it is long-term, because I'm keeping these kids in school so that they don't die, and they can then get an education, and then they can feel secure. So you might be thinking short-term when you focus on the law. These are simple things, Justice versus mercy, the idea of when do we apply justice, and whether we can focus on mercy rather than justice, These are key ideas that come out in one of KIDDER'S paradigm. And finally, he brought in the idea of truth versus loyalty again, where perhaps if you're in the intelligence agencies, these are far more resonant with you, the idea of truth versus loyalty. You might be asked a question, but I mean, on a daily basis, teachers may ask me questions about individual kids that we have not decided to share that information at the moment, because if you share and it gets into the open, it might affect the way the matter is resolved, and it might affect how the child is perceived within the classroom. And so sometimes you maybe not necessarily are telling a mystery. You have to be loyal to the mission perhaps that you're trying to achieve within the school. So, but KIDDER also provides what he calls resolution principles. Whenever he's stuck, he says there are three main principles that you can apply to help you to resolve these ideas. The first one is Kantian. Immanuel Kant, famous German philosopher, uses a rules-based. He says he doesn't want to make a decision that its maxim could not be applied in other universal situations. And he says stick to principles no matter what. There's also ends-based, very common in schools, where we go for the greatest good, for the greatest number, especially with limited resources, limited staffing, limited space, the greatest good for the greatest number, and sometimes schools have to do that. It's quite utilitarian, and depending on how you want to view it, you could go as far as to say it's socialism. It's those ideas that comes in. And then we talk about the care-based, where you do unto others as you'd like to have them do unto you, where you really think about, is this in the best interest of the child, coming back to the ethic of the profession that Shapiro and Stefkovich spoke about in their book. So you see that kind of coming together of the big ideas right across the board, where all these philosophers and the writers and the ethicists, they're coming together with the same kind of thinking. But I quite like this one, the idea of the simple three things, to solve this problem, the REC, as I want to call them: rules, ends, or care. And I really try to look through these lenses when I'm faced with ethical dilemmas. And so getting closer to the end, we are thinking of ethical. KIDDER provides ethical checkpoints. He provides a kind of protocol in which you can go through. It's an interesting protocol. I've tried to use it and I've found it quite effective, where you really just go through it step by step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 steps. And in the end, you have to make a decision. And sometimes you solve it by looking for a third way to solve it. You maybe look at the third way to solve it, which the idea of a trilemma, where that is halfway. Sometimes you learn to think like that rather than choose one or the other. And then in all of this, in the end, you have to come to the idea of what is ethical leadership. In the end, this is what this is about. Are you demonstrating ethical leadership? I believe I've tried to strive for that. I don't know if I'm perfect all the time. As KIDDER says, it's a process, and we want to get to the point where we exercise enough that our judgment is right at every turn, especially when we're talking about children in the middle of this. You really don't want to mess someone up because you're not equipped, you're not ethically fit. So you really need to become ethically fit and develop your ethical prowess, so to speak. So ethical leadership can be summarized as, ethical leadership serves others. Very important. It manifests honesty, it respects others, it shows justice, and it builds community. As a school leader, it's essential that your ethical leadership is one that has a legacy to it, and something that people can emulate, and something that people can look up to, and something that people can use as a barometer of how they progress and learn. So very, very important that and this is a kind of summary, and then I'll bring it to the end with the idea of some core values that dominate ethical leadership. The idea of non-maleficence, do no harm. I think that's quite powerful, do no harm. And then beneficence, a word that I've come across since I've begun to do this kind of thinking, the idea of promoting good, and that's different from benevolence, which is doing good. Promoting good is beneficence, which is quite different in the idea of always trying to look at, what is really the right thing to do, and doing a lot more than just doing it, but also promoting it. I think it's a word that maybe should be within many school missions. And then we are talking about justice, equality, and right and fairness. And these are coming from the ideas of the ethic of critique, perhaps the ethic of care, and even the ethic of the profession. So in the end, these are the core values that I want to live my life by as an educational administrator. I think throughout this course, I've learned so much. I really, really am appreciative of the introduction of KIDDER'S work. I've never heard about his work. I I did a presentation recently in a conference about ethical leadership, and if I had known about KIDDER'S work, I would have preferred to use that. Not that what I did was wrong, but it would have added a lot of another dimension to the thinking, and would have provided educators with perhaps a protocol. They could have resolved it, because that was one of the questions that I was asking. Can I have a protocol? And my answer at the time was, we really just have to learn to look through the lenses and take our time. And that's not bad advice. It's just that with a protocol, many people also feel a lot more supported if they can feel like they're going through some steps. So that is my view on this. And as I take it back to the final part of this, I really have learned a lot in this course, and I'll really try to apply as much as I can as I move forward as an education leader. So thank you very much, and I hope I didn't bore you too much. All right, and thanks. I'll provide a reflection afterwards and provide a link for this later.